Remember the bizarre 3D animation quality of the 90s? Well, I don't. I wasn't born yet. But you can't deny the strange, uncanny yet charming vibe that these old decrepit animation programs can produce. Today I, a Zoomer, am going to get my grubby little hands on some of the weirdest 1990s CGI software I can find. So join me as we explore these odd programs that are lost to time and create some 1990s masterpieces with them. Created by Microsoft in 1995, 3D Movie Maker is an animation program that allows kids to create goofy little scenes with pre-made characters and objects. It is very clear that this program has some incredible meme potential, as shown by many old YouTube videos such as this absolute masterpiece. And so, I downloaded and booted up this program, and to my absolute surprise, despite it being made for Windows 95, it can still run on Windows 11. We hop onto the program and are greeted by this wacky little guy named McZ.
Nice to finally meet you face to face.
We then watch in horror as he shoves items into this seemingly bottomless bag, and then he gets on a shopping cart roller coaster, and then lands on a sidewalk and dies. But anyway, we end up at a theater booth while McZ is absolutely jamming it up, and he asks if we want to watch or make a movie. I decided to start off by watching a movie, and the one called Bongo really struck my eye. After getting mentally scarred from whatever that was, I leave the movie theater only to be met with more nightmare fuel. This is Melanie, and she's the tutorial guide that's going to teach me how to create a 3D logo. I'm first prompted to choose a background, and then the text, as well as the animation for the text, and after putting it all together, I ended up with this. Thanks, Melanie! After that, I decide it's finally time for me to create my own movie with actors and dialogue from scratch. I selected a scene and started by adding this kind young looking gentleman from the list of actors. I definitely struggled to figure out how to maneuver the tools and options at first, and it was quite finicky. It took me an embarrassingly long amount of time to learn how to change my dude's outfit and give him some animations, but boy was he vibing once I did. I then scrolled through the list of dialogue sounds and elected to record my own.
Wow, I sure hope this plane doesn't blow up.
I then added some raps and learned how to change the scene, and from there it was pretty much smooth sailing. And without further ado, I present to you my movie.
Wow, I sure hope this plane doesn't blow up.
Hey, that was excellent.
Honestly, I really liked 3D Movie Maker. It was really charming, and you could tell the developers really cared about making a fun experience for the user. My only wish is that they removed Melanie. So I chanced upon this article that shows some very beautiful old CGI art, and they all have one thing in common. They were made with a program called Pavre. So naturally, I boot up this program without doing any research whatsoever, and I'm immediately jump-scared by the realization that this program is entirely code-based and has no visual interface. But fear not, because the knowledge I gained from my 9th grade programming class is going to come in absolute clutch here. The program starts you out with pre-made code that displays funny little images, and I just absolutely adore the noise it makes whenever you run the code. I decided to use the file called Taurus as the base plate for my own render. I removed all the objects. objects in the code, which removed them from the scene, and I began messing around with random things I could do, like adding this pretty little rainbow. I then was able to change the ground texture and add a funny little blue pancake. I then made a huge discovery that I could change the audio that plays when it renders, and I decided to replace it with a way better sound. It was really fun changing the code and then getting to be surprised by whatever the result of that change was, like accidentally making my pancake look like this. And after about an hour of writing code / borrowing from other projects, I present to you my grand creation. I call him the Donut of Truth. Just look at how cute he is. Pavre was actually really fun to use, and it was quite cool to see such a uniquely different CGI software. You know Blender? The greatest modern 3D software out there? Yeah, the first version of it was released in 1995. Unlike the other two programs I discussed, Blender 1.0 was painfully difficult to get my hands on, as it was made for a prehistoric operating system. But luckily, there's a half-hour-long tutorial on how to get this thing running by a YouTuber called Alpenstorm. Thank you! But I now have a working emulator with Blender 1.0 installed and ready to use. Now let me just tell you, this program was horrendous. The similarities between modern-day Blender were there, but the layout was just so much less intuitive and it felt like nothing made sense. I couldn't render the scene because I was missing a camera, but after adding a camera, I still couldn't render the scene because I was missing a camera. It took me an entire hour just to figure out how to add a material to an object. Half the time, I'd just accidentally make everything in the scene disappear. But once I got it somewhat under my belt, I was able to make a pretty little house with a tree. I then decided to add some text to my scene, and it immediately crashed on me. So those were some of the weirdest 90s CGI programs I could find. I definitely was pleasantly surprised by how cool and unique some of these programs are, and I hope they never get completely buried by time, except for Blender 1.0, that was horrible.
CGI. It's a term I'm willing to bet you've heard before, because it's everywhere. This worm, this purple man, everything in between is the work of computer-generated images. Regardless of the benefits or the faults, CGI has found itself as an essential, unanimous part of media production. Which is kind of funny, because just a few decades ago this technology was unnoticed by most of the general public. It was time-consuming, highly technical, and niche. I mean, think about it. Even the most powerful supercomputers of the 60s, 70s, and 80s couldn't hold a candle next to this smart fridge. And while most researchers were using these to make math go faster, CGI could just make funny-looking pictures. The value it would have was not easily apparent, and the skills you would need to get into all this in the first place was not for the faint of heart. Now, I don't want to talk too much about the live-action CGI stuff here, just the pure, good CGI demos and shorts leading up to, let's say, Toy Story.
I mean that if I point at this particular point and tell the computer to move that point by another push-button command, it will move not only that point, but all three lines that are attached to it.
And the delay between it's doing what you want it to is because it's computing all these changes.
That's correct.
CGI has actually been around for quite a while. In the 50s, analog computers could graph out patterns and lines. By the 60s, we would have wireframe demos, morphing of images, but it's not quite what we think of as true CGI today. This decade has a lot of important milestones, sure, but a lot of them look like this. For the more conventional works, we would have to go into the 1970s. One of the most significant demos here was 1972's aptly named Computer Animated Hand. You can see some of the earliest full meshes, shading, and even a human face. Sure, it's slightly uncanny, but I'd argue by this point it was almost more cartoonish than creepy. Following up on this was 1974's Faces and Body Parts, which expanded on the human face and added the element of speech.
How happy is the little stone that rambles in the road alone and never cares about careers and exigencies never fears.
These early tests were groundbreaking, sure, but in the process found themselves deep in the uncanny valley. Not all CGI was being done for research, though. There was a small commercial element to all this even in the early 1970s, namely in advertising and station breaks. You can find several companies putting out demo reels showing any ads they've produced along with the tech demos they've created. These demos could bring in more clients and potentially more employees interested in working with what was at the time a very niche segment of the computer industry. One of my favorites is Maggie Synthavision's 1974 reel.
Hi, guess where I came from? A computer. Me and my hat. And everything else you're gonna see in this film.
There's certainly limitations in the CGI of the era, that's apparent, but this is actually one of the most advanced demos I've found. Simple polygonal shapes, flat colors without texture. Cityscapes and cars were quite popular in 80s CGI, but for the 70s, this is astounding. It's a very empty space. You can tell where the world begins and ends, but that's par for the course in most early CGI. By the late 70s, we would start to see the earliest short films using three-dimensional polygons. Here is 1978's On and Off at the Circus. That was disturbing. The circus, the clown, the way this bear floats around. Computing physics in an animation like this wasn't going to happen. A lot of these researchers weren't traditional animators. They came from computer backgrounds, and this was a fun way to show off the cutting-edge tech at the time. Complex backgrounds of anything more than a simple color would be pretty unrealistic to expect. This is 1970s CGI after all. Released the same year, Voyager 2 Encounters Jupiter has aged much better. Having a background of stars was ideal in early CGI. You don't need to worry about rendering more objects. It gives much needed spatial context. And you don't have a black void. Also, having a setting of space makes the lighting a bit more realistic since you only need to account for one light source, the sun. Even with slightly janky animations, the camera moves well, and this is a top-tier demo for the 70s. By the end of the decade, in 1978, the first ray tracing demo was produced. The Complete Angler. It's a bona fide classic. You could call this the birth of Vaporwave. Look at those refractions and reflections. At the end, we get this camera movement into the courtyard, and we get water. Things were moving pretty fast, at least the way I'm describing them. The gap between the early 70s CGI and the late 70s was pretty big, but the 80s, well, it just had a lot more going on. There's a particular fascination with landscapes in the early 80s. Take Peak, an early fractal demo. It's a mountain sitting on a plane in a void. Fractals allowed you to create these models without actually modeling every individual surface, which made it ideal for mountainous terrain. Violiba is another demo from the same year, and I prefer this, not just because it has a Utah teapot at the beginning. There's an amazing sense of scale here, and if you really squint your eyes and shake your head around a lot, it looks like real mountains. A lot of landscapes in these early 80s shorts. Take Carla's Island from 81. We get this approximation of water and weather systems. Two islands on an empty sea. The waves move in a very mathematical fashion. The clouds aren't quite transparent, but the reflections are pretty convincing at first glance. And look how the lighting changes. It's wonderful. You'll notice a trend of a lot of cities being rendered in this time, especially in advertising. Generally, these would have a low polygon city filled with skyscrapers and streets, devoid of any background. Landscapes and cities could be represented by simple polygonal shapes. They don't need to move around, so you don't need to animate parts of a character. So, a lot of this has aged decently well. Early 80s demos would generally avoid shadows. You might notice these shadowed gradients on objects, but it always looks really harsh. One of my favorites, and one of the most unsettling shorts, is 1981's Adam Powers' The Juggler. As he keeps juggling, he warps reality, and he keeps juggling, and then he warps reality, and then he disappears. The music doesn't help ease the tension in the air. This feels like it defines a lot of the early 80s CGI. Overly saturated colors, set in space. Most objects don't cast shadows, but when they do, oh, they sure do. 1982 was a big year for CGI because we got Tron. You remember Tron? Look at it go. We also got the Genesis effect in Star Trek II, using some of those fractal landscape techniques we saw earlier. And just 1 year later, we'd be blessed with the short demo When Mandrills Ruled Heaven. It has ray tracing, and a monkey. A lot of these demos have a real nightmare dreamscape vibe. Here's a skeleton man who uses his eye to play billiards. I do appreciate the bouncing of the balls, though. Physics simulations are appreciated because, well, this was the alternative. As far as skeletons go, though, I think this 1983 Ohio State demo does it best. It's just a hopping, happy skeleton man, walking through empty rooms with no ceiling. It's quite an aesthetic. Less appealing is this. Music choice, the xylophone floor, the bears. It's so dense, every single image has so many things going on. In 1984, we get one of my favorite short films of the early CGI era, High Fidelity. It's about shapes, doing fun things on a fun polygonal island. What I love so much about this is how it works within the limitations of CGI at the time. Our protagonists aren't humanoids, they're just shapes. The background is covered in lush, polygonal foliage. The camera appears to be ray traced, bouncing rays from a camera to the camera. It's funny. Two-dimensional dog. I imagine the skybox as a texture, and it works. Sure, you don't have self-shadowing, but I can easily suspend my disbelief. On the other hand, we have Snoot and Muttley, made the same year. The first frame, the very first frame, we're greeted with this weird smooth lighting, the bizarre texture on the flat plane, the simple polygons, and complete black void in the background. I can't see any shadows here, but the main focus is on these two birds, with human eyes. It was a showcase of how emotion could be shown in these CGI characters, and sure, it succeeds in that, but at what cost? This may or may not be the original music, but it's something. Just because I feel like mentioning it, here's 1984's First Flight. What catches me off guard is the transparency effects of the clouds. The bird animation it's very bird-like. I get real PlayStation 1 cutscene vibes here. Not a lot to say, but yeah, that's neat. Here's Maggie Synthavision's demo from 1984, a decade after we first looked at them.
Oh, this will be fun. Come on inside. Here, how about going on a nice little ride?
Rather than starting with the Happy Hat Man, we get Dismembered Clown. We get the more traditional smooth polygons and baked lighting effects you've seen. It's a very specific early CGI vibe I'm sure you've all appreciated before. And the ray tracing, that's improved as well. This Pac-Man cereal ad, that's something. And at the end we get a much more convincing water demo than I've seen yet. Here's a fun one. It's Botco.
Get all your fusion and fission needs at Botco, the #1 name in high-energy fuels. Matter, antimatter, it doesn't matter at Botco.
It's a fake ad created by Pacific Data Images, and it has all the tropes of traditional CGI, the void of a background, seemingly empty spaces, but at least there's some hills now, and clouds, and shadows. I like it.
Them all. Don't pay those expensive re-entry fees. We'll bring the widest variety of particles, subparticle, and theoretical energy fuels factory direct to you.
Now, here's something I've always questioned when it comes to older CGI demos. Generally, we only have access to the low-quality rips, and it's hard to rule out whether the low resolution and film grain makes it seem a little bit more creepy. I don't necessarily think that's the case, but the VHS quality demos do have a certain nostalgic appeal. But luckily, we have a high-quality rip of the famous Brilliance advert. As you can see, it stars Sexy Robot Lady. It's set in space. Who would have guessed? And while the robot herself isn't that shiny, the table sure is. I'm pretty sure I used this on a thumbnail once. Looking at the behind-the-scenes footage, the original concept art was amazing. It's also pretty funny that they refer to this as photorealistic.
It has to be something where you really can't tell if she's real or if she's computerized. Her movements are very human and she's very sexy but very strong.
The definition of photorealism changes constantly, and I think as we're exposed to more advanced CGI, our definition shifts as well. It's like the owl from the beginning of Labyrinth. That was photorealistic back in '86, but today, not so much. I don't know, maybe if it was in 480p it'd look better. Let's try that. Sure, yeah, that's great. By the mid-'80s, we have the start of the oh-so-famous Pixar shorts. Not really, though. Pixar, at this point, was technically a division of Lucasfilms, 1984's The Adventures of Andre and Wally B. Unlike many of the prior tech demos, this had an ulterior motive for its creation. Not just as a technical marvel, which it was, but as an artistic work to show off the potential of CGI as a medium for animation. Sure, that's been done before, but, you know, they really leaned into it here. The story is simple. A blue thing finds a bee, runs away from the bee stings the blue thing throws the hat. Pixar is generally a step ahead throughout all these demos. They always bring something new to the table and show truly state-of-the-art technology. But with that being said, I don't like this one. I understand it has big technical achievements such as the jiggly soft bodies and the motion blur. Look at that motion blur. But there's so many other things that bother me. It's this use of real textures on these low poly surfaces. The lighting in the background feels so off, but the trees use realistic textures. Those tree models are also way better than you expect for 1984, but still. This was all due to limitations of early CGI. It's why it looks the way it does. And it works well within its own restraints, but, you know, I'm still gonna complain. There is a background, there are things behind the focus of the animation, but it's like a parallel world where things don't look like the things they're supposed to. Character animations are better than what you'd expect, though, but it is a far cry from replicating that hand-drawn animation style. Everything looks smooth. It moves smooth. It's too smooth. A good general rule is that any human that has a polygon count equivalent to that of a kazooie is going to have those select visual distinctions. The use of emotion in the face is pretty great for the time, I'll give it that. But the scary French man playing piano with laughing masks, it's... that was a decision. As he plays, it starts to get a bit weirder, and eventually it devolves into this. At the end, I guess it's like in Dr. Stone when all the people turn to stone, and yeah, getting humans to work in CGI, even by this point, was an issue. With this in mind, I gotta bring up the Dire Straits' Money for Nothing music video. And I love it. Like, it's not pushing too many... It's not too wacky, but the CGI work I still think is phenomenal. There's a lot of used space in which it has the limitations of basic shader colors and tile floors, and it works well. That's what I'm trying to say. Sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish whether demos are trying to be stylized or realistic. Take one of my favorites, 1985's Chromosaurus. Look at it. Look at the dinosaurs. Chrome dinosaurs. I don't really see a texture on the ground, but a few cracks here and there. Maybe that's a texture. A few mountains. Look at those mountains and some clouds. Instant classic. There's a consistency in the themes here. There's a lot of rigid bodies, shiny surfaces, leaning into the 80s computer zeitgeist of the era. However, some short films took a very different direction. Look at that background. Look at this thing. It's great. It's kind of creepy. I don't know exactly what's going on all the time. Quest from 85 as well shows some peak aesthetic with some new ideas. We follow a thing that travels through things. It has some nice water effects for the time, and the world feels alive, more complex than what we'd normally get. I really like this one. It's got some good reflections and refractions and things. A lot of weird things. 1986 saw the release of what may be the most single famous short of the early CGI era. It's Luxo Jr. There he is. This Pixar classic received such a good response at SIGGRAPH you reportedly couldn't hear the music or sound effects over all the cheering. And yeah, it's still great. Animation quality has a huge upgrade from Wall-E. The lighting and self-shadows, revolutionary. But one thing that's always felt a bit weird to me is the background. It's just nothing. It doesn't exist. The camera doesn't move either, and both of these are technical limitations. It would take too much time to render. It feels a little creepy, right? Is that just me? It's probably just me. Another Pixar short released around the same time is one of my favorites. It's Beach Chair. It has a chair, and it touches water, and it leaves. It's 18 seconds long, but look at that water. It was around this point you could also find some more complex physics simulations going around. Another OSU demo from 87 shows off rigid body simulations in a black void on a plane. One of the key aspects that makes computer animation of today possible is the automation of certain tasks, calculating physics that look as realistic as possible. You could do it by hand, but if the computer does it, hey, it's going to save a lot of time. I love these soccer balls here. Look, they even bounce. And I suppose this is a good time to explain why the checkerboards and black voids are so prevalent in all these demos. A checkerboard gives depth, more so than a basic colored surface. And having a background is useless unless you just want to show the things that are right there. Why make it harder and longer to render just for this aesthetically pleasing nonsense? The quality of ads was improving at an astounding rate around this time. Just 2 years after Brilliance, we got this Hawaiian Punch ad. That music slaps, even if it is just knockoff Trent Reznor. But there's so much detail in some of these models, far more than I'd expect. It's also a lot longer than Brilliance. The backgrounds are, yeah, it's still kind of a black void over there, but still, whatever. In 1987, we get my favorite Pixar short film, Volume Visualization on Image Computer. We get volume visualizations, which in this case I guess means clouds. Fluffy, good, honest clouds. That's what I'm talking about. A lot of physics stuff around this point. Fabricated rhythm, a cloth demo, was a cloth demo. I mean, it's not all that incredible on the surface. The cloth, yeah, it looks like a good cloth, but listen to this original soundtrack. An original song set to go alongside what is, let me remind you, a tech demo of cloth physics.
Fabricated rhythm, that's no way of living. Fabricated rhythm is breaking my heart. Fabricated rhythm, such a crazy rhythm. Fabricated rhythm is tearing me apart.
Is this video gonna get claimed now? Stanley and Stella in Breaking the Ice is a fairly popular CGI short film. It's set in a sphere. It's got some weird birds. I don't like that bird. There's the fish from Shark Tale. I'm sorry, those eyes ruin it for me. It's all technical achievement aside. Just get rid of the human eyes on birds. Who knew Snoot and Muttley was such a trendsetter? One of my favorite demos of this year is Mental Images, intended to be an abstract short film, which it is. It's a little weird, but it's got some atmospheric moments, a sense of scale, the lighting, it's all good. These reflections at the end, they're really good. I mean, really good. And we have another Pixar short, Red's Dream. I have some mixed feelings about this one as well. I think the outside setting and lighting here is exceptional. The reflections are amazing, the LED sign, the rain, it's all great. The lighting on the bikes here bothers me a bit, but whatever. It's a bit plasticky. A lot of the lighting in this for the whole decade is a bit plasticky. The real creepy part is when we get inside the dream of the unicycle, and we find this rubbery-faced clown with the eyes of one Carl Wheezer. Clowns, they don't work in CGI. Let's quit it with the clowns. I'm assuming there was a lot of work going into the animations and soft body mesh of this guy, because we're back into the black void. In 1988, we would get the biggest leap forward in computer graphics. I present to you dinosaur stuff. Many of the tech demos during this era still wouldn't have shadows. Usually it was to show off new physics or dynamic polygon movements, but still, I would like shadows. The tree from 1988's Natural Phenomenon. That's a good-looking tree. Probably the best tree I've ever seen. Ever. Also, in 1988, Particle Dream shows off some truly stunning and startling effects. It's a bit weird. It only gets weirder, though, with possibly the most terrifying CGI demo of the 1980s. 1988's Polygon. Just every nightmare rolled into one, isn't it? You got a void of a background, simple lighting, and this thing. For all the creepy stuff, I gotta ask, is this a shitpost? Like the first shitpost? Because it feels like it. It's so far removed from everything else released in this time. There's very obviously clipping issues and animation problems throughout. The same year, we get another CGI work that spawned this lifelong fear of early CGI in me. It's another Pixar short, and a famous one at that, Tin Toy. On a technical level, again, very impressive, but I hate it. We aren't in a void anymore, but it's a single empty room. Very liminal spaces here. The textures are almost realistic, but nothing looks quite real. The worst part is that baby. This is one of the most horrifying things I can imagine seeing in the 1980s, or the 90s, or ever. I don't care about the technical accomplishments of this at this point. It's just disturbing. I've never been a fan of this short, but it is possibly the best example of creepy 1980s CGI. But I do like those background characters. They look how I feel. Even as polygon counts increased, realistic textures stretch across the floor, it only makes things more off-putting. We're past the shadowless worlds and money-for-nothing cartoonish humans. And as things look better, in some ways, they kind of look worse. And I think part of this reason is lighting. See, in the real world, photons are emitted from a surface and they hit an object and they're either bounced off or absorbed. Almost everything you see reflects some light, casting subtle colors on what aren't necessarily shiny surfaces. In modern computing, you can take all this light and just calculate it with path tracing of, well, what's that going to look like? Oh, that looks great. You can't do that here. You can't do that for a long time. So instead, they have to approximate. What we get is something that looks almost real, but light doesn't work as it should. It's like an uncanny valley, but instead of measuring how human something looks, it's how real does it look. And this is close to reality, but something important, that element of lighting, is off. It's also why lighting in shaded areas, like under the couch, looks so flat. It's why everything looks so flat. There's no indirect lighting from other objects. Well, to get away from some of this realism, let's look at Jab Jab Land. I don't like Jab Jab Land. Chris Wedge of OSU, the creator of this masterpiece, had some other interesting shorts, including Balloon Guy. I gotta say, I love those jiggly physics on display. And the dog, what a dog! Another unsettling work is The Little Death from '89. Lot wrong here for me. First off, the dog. That's supposed to be a dog. The landscape is devoid of life. The dancing figures... short, it's locomotion. It's just a train. A moving train. A Mugen train. I like how the train squishes and squashes. That's kind of fun. I don't love the trees and grass textures, but everything is so cartoony it gets a pass. You know, not all early CGI needs to instill fear in your heart. Take this.